Hello wrestling fans. Thanks for tuning in. Jumping into Chapter 4 of Playboy Gary Hart's book, My Life in Wrestling. With a little help from my friends. Through the use of the Pro Wrestle Machine. Chapter 4. Dallas. At the time there were two booking offices out of Texas. One was in Amarillo, owned by Dory Funk Sr. and Doc Sarbalis, and the other was in Houston, owned by Morris Siegel. They were two separate entities with no ties together other than both being part of the NWA. Each booking office was responsible to supply talent for their specific towns. Dory Sr. handled West Texas, and Morris controlled the rest of the state. That was unusual because aside from California, where Roy Shire ran San Francisco and Michael Bell was in charge of Los Angeles, most states had one booking office. The Dallas territory, which got their talent from Morris Siegel out of Houston, was run by Fritz von Erich and Ed McLemore. Ed was a very wealthy guy who owned 12 radio stations throughout Texas, Arkansas, Louisiana, and Oklahoma, and used to bring in musical acts like Elvis Presley, Jerry Lee Lewis, Eddie Arnold, and Hank Williams to play the Sportatorium. After Fritz graduated Southern Methodist University with a degree in business administration, he went to work for Ed as his bookkeeper, and as time went by, Ed started running wrestling shows in the Sportatorium, which is how Fritz broke into the wrestling business. When I arrived in Dallas in the fall of 1966, I moved into the Alamo Plaza Motel and was told that I would be managing the team of Carl von Bronner, who had been in a successful tag team with his brother Kurt, and Al Costello, who had been in the Fabulous Kangaroos. When I was told I would be managing them, I wasn't exactly overjoyed. Don't get me wrong, I had the greatest respect for Carl and Al, but I just didn't think they would make a good team. More importantly, I didn't want someone else to select talent for me. I was hoping to choose the guys I would manage myself. In any event, I was determined to get Al, Carl, and I over in Dallas, and in order to do that, everyone had to be on the same page. When there are 4 wrestlers, a manager, and a referee involved in a match, everyone must work together and be as cooperative as possible to make it the best match possible. Dirty Dick Raines was an old-time wrestler who was refereeing in the Dallas area, and he was very helpful to me in that regard. During Al and Carl's matches, Dick would allow me to distract him and would get into heated arguments with me that the fans just ate up. Our arguments got over so well that we eventually came up with the idea that I should wrestle him with one arm tied behind my back. Of course, I got that idea from my feud with announcer Alan Ruby in Michigan. Dick and I wrestled in 5 major cities throughout Texas, and each time I put Dick over. To show you what a great guy Dick was, every night after our matches, he would insist that after I get my arm untied, I should come over to him and beat him up so that I could get my heat back. Unfortunately, not all referees were that wonderful. Marvin Jones, a referee who had quite a bit of influence in the office, took an immediate dislike to me for some reason, and set out to make life as difficult as possible for me. Marvin was anti-Gary Hart in every way and refused to react to anything I would do during matches in which he was the referee and I was the manager. I would try to distract him, and he would ignore me. I would yell at him from the ring apron, but he wouldn't turn around. I would roll under the bottom rope during a match, and he wouldn't flinch. It was as if I wasn't even there. Referees are so important in wrestling. A good referee can add excitement and pandemonium to a match by doing little things, but Marvin refused to do anything that might get me over the slightest bit. Then, in the office, he started telling anyone who would listen that tag teams would never draw in Dallas, planting seeds of doubt in everyone's head about how successful Al, Carl, and I could be. In 1966, Dallas was not a tag team territory. Yes, there had been the occasional tag team, but Marvin put me in a position where I had to prove that a regular tag team could make it in Dallas, and the onus was literally on me to find a tag team that Al and Carl could draw money with. At the time, Fritz and Waldo von Erich were portraying evil heel Nazi brothers, but weren't a tag team per se. Fritz was the number 1 heel, and Waldo was the guy who the babyfaces would beat before they faced Fritz. I went to the office and asked if Al and Carl could be booked in a match against Fritz and Waldo. Even though heel versus heel matches had been done in Texas, Danny Pledges, the booker, was totally against it. After insisting and arguing that the territory needed something fresh, Danny finally relented and agreed to give my idea a shot. When it was time to give the interview to promote the match, I went on TV and proclaimed, Fritz and Waldo von Erich are not really Germans. Waldo is Canadian, and Fritz is a Texan whose real name is Jack Adkisson, and he went to Southern Methodist University. The Von Erichs are total phonies, and are afraid to wrestle Al and Carl. In those days, there was no editing of tapes. The shows ran as they were recorded, and whatever was said went out over the air. When I went back to the dressing room, Danny was furious with me for my promo, and immediately called the station to see if they could take the interview out. They couldn't, and it was left in. I explained that I did it to promote the match, and kept apologizing. But in reality, I wasn't sorry. The territory was dead and needed to be boosted, and I knew it was the right thing to do to build up heat for their match. Besides, everything I said was true. Fritz did play football and throw discus for SMU, and he even played football for the Dallas Texans, so it's not exactly like I was exposing the business. The night of the match, when Fritz and Waldo came to the ring for their match against Al and Carl, the fans went crazy. People mobbed them on their way down the aisle, and they were treated like heroes and turned babyfaces instantly. It seems as soon as I told the people that Fritz was a hometown boy, Texas just fell in love with him. Plus, even though Waldo was not a Texan, just by his association with Fritz, he was loved as well. After I created the first Von Erich babyfaces in Dallas, business picked up immediately. Meanwhile, in Houston, Morris Siegel was gravely ill, having suffered several heart attacks. When he died right after Christmas 1966, his right-hand man and a television announcer, Paul Bosch, bought the Houston booking office from Morris' widow. However, the Dallas territory was doing so well that Fritz Von Erich and Ed McLemore conspired to literally steal the booking office from Paul by taking control of the talent and moving the booking headquarters from Houston to Dallas. That meant that all of the Texas promoters who had gotten their talent from Houston now had to get their talent from Fritz, Ed, and the Dallas office. The reason Fritz and Ed were able to pull off that major coup was twofold. First of all, their wrestling show out of Dallas was on KTVT, a large cable channel that played throughout Texas, Louisiana, Oklahoma, Arkansas, and New Mexico, while Paul's TV show only aired in Houston. Any Texan promoter who might have spoken out against Fritz and Ed for their hostile takeover had to consider the fact that they controlled the largest cable channel in Texas. The second reason was the NWA. Even though the NWA was the governing body of wrestling, and one might think they could have gotten involved and protected Paul's booking office, Fritz had powerful friends like Sam Mushnick, Bob Geigel, and Jim Barnett, established NWA members, who were firmly in Fritz's corner because he had worked for them and made them a lot of money. Paul Bosch was in a no-win situation, and had no choice but to make a deal with Fritz and Ed and start accepting talent from Dallas. For my first booking into Houston, I went into the Houston Recreation Center, managing Al and Carl. When we got our pay, I noticed that Al and Carl got $200 each, while I got $75. I always got the same payoff as the guys that I managed, so I didn't understand why things would be different in Houston. I went right to Danny Pletches, the booker, and demanded to know why I got shortchanged. I explained that I was just as important to the match as Al and Carl were, and if I wasn't needed at ringside to help them draw, they shouldn't have booked me that night. I was angry, but Danny asked me not to make a scene with Paul, assuring me that he would straighten everything out. The following week, we went back to Houston, and Al and Carl made $100 each, while I made $50. Now, I was pissed. Once again, I went to Danny and demanded to be paid the same as what Al and Carl got. Danny offered to pay me the difference out of the Dallas office, and while I appreciated his offer, it was the principle. I wanted to be treated right by the promoter I was working for, even though I was savvy enough to understand that Paul Bosch had an ulterior motive for paying me less than I deserved. Paul was mad at Fritz and Ed for taking his booking office, but since he couldn't do anything to them, he took it out on me. Paul was clever enough to realize that I was the reason for the Dallas office's recent success, and figured if he could chase me away, he could do some real damage to Fritz and Ed and reclaim his booking office. Even though I knew why Paul was deliberately messing with me, out of respect for Danny, once again I bit my tongue. Business was so good that Paul booked the Sam Houston Coliseum for the next week. Paul wanted to get into that arena so badly that he actually mortgaged his home and put a deposit down for a year in order to get it. For the first big show, Paul booked Fritz and Waldo versus Al and Carl, and I wrestled underneath. Paul grossed $13,000 that night, and paid Al and Carl $300 each. I got $150. And not only did I manage in the main event, but I also wrestled. I found Danny and demanded, I want to talk to Paul Bosch. He stole money from me 2 weeks ago, he stole money from me last week, and he stole money from me tonight. Enough is enough. We found Paul standing in the shower talking with Pepper Gomez, and when Pepper walked out, Danny and I walked in. In a condescending voice, Paul asked, "Well, how can I help you?" "I haven't been very happy with my payoffs," I said. "Well, you're only a manager," he sneered. "If you were more than that, you would deserve more money." As soon as he said that, I slapped him as hard as I could right across his face. I don't think anybody had ever done that to him before, but obviously, he had never messed with a street kid from Chicago. Right then, Danny grabbed me and pulled me out of the shower screaming, "Don't you ever raise your hand to a promoter in front of me again." I just pulled myself away from Danny and stormed out of the Coliseum. The next day, Carl, Al, and I were booked in Beaumont, which was a Paul Bosch spot show, but I didn't show up. Al called me and tried to sweet-talk me by saying he and Carl felt bad about what happened, but they didn't. They were just happy to be making main event money and didn't care what I made. Anytime I wanted to take a stand on something in the past, Jim Myers was always with me. Right or wrong, we were partners and in it together. Carl and Al were different. They couldn't understand why I was upset because I was making less money than they did, and acted like I should be happy that I was with international wrestling stars. Al and Carl showed no loyalty to me, and didn't seem to understand that I was the guy who helped them become successful in Dallas. During my conversation with Al, he mentioned that Fritz and Ed wanted to see me at their office on Monday morning. So on Monday morning, I went to their office in the Sportatorium, and sat with Fritz, Ed, and Danny Pletches. Fritz started telling me that I was way out of line and too big for my britches, and even threw in a dramatic "How dare you raise your hand to a promoter of the NWA?" I couldn't believe their hypocrisy, and went off on them, arguing, "You stole that man's business. You literally stole Paul Bosch's booking office. You waited until his boss died and then you stole what he was waiting for right out from under him. Now you're upset with me for slapping him because he stole my money?" They didn't care what I had to say, though, reminding me that they were the boss and that I had to do whatever they wanted, and the first thing they wanted me to do was to drop the money issue with Paul. I couldn't believe that they were treating me that way after all I had just done for them, because I truly believe I saved their promotion. When I arrived in Dallas, business was horrible. I went out there every night as a manager and fought my way through the crowds, getting Al and Carl over as big-time heels. Then, I single-handedly turned Fritz and Waldo babyfaces, which helped draw big money in Dallas and Fort Worth. I know for a fact that my arrival in Dallas had a lot to do with the money being drawn, because believe me when I tell you, it wasn't being drawn until I got there. Because of me, both the Dallas promotion and Fritz got over so strong that he and Ed were able to usurp the booking office from Paul Bosch and become big-time promoters in Texas. Instead of treating me like garbage, Fritz and Ed should have been on their knees thanking me. Instead, they treated me like a dog, so I walked over to a calendar on the wall, pointed to the date 2 weeks from that day and declared, "On that date I will be gone." 2 weeks to the day, I packed my bags and left Dallas.